In the face of evil, sometimes it's difficult to know what to do. Images of genocide make us weep, as do images of racism. So often, such images are from places that are easy to forget. As Americans, we have the luxury of allowing the victims of such atrocities to remain nameless. We need not learn the names of those killed in the latest chemical attack in Syria, or those who died last week in the terrorist attack in Barcelona, or even those who stood up to hate in Charlottesville. Instead, we can go numb, choosing when to look at these images and when to turn them off. The 5 women in today's story from Exodus didn't have that luxury. Genocide was happening to them. In this story, the face of evil is Pharaoh. Pharaoh fears that one day the Hebrews will overpower his people, the Egyptians. So he oppresses them in a public policy designed to create division between the Israelites and the Egyptians. When this slavery and oppression fail to kill the Hebrews, Pharaoh's evil escalates. He commands 2 Hebrew midwives. When you act as midwives to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it's a boy, kill him. But the midwives resist. They subvert this heinous policy because they fear God, not Pharaoh. While the Egyptians' fear of the Israelites leads to their failure, the women's fear of God leads to their success. They let the boys live. In the course of their normal work, the midwives live out God's calling. These midwives aren't leaders in their community. They're not in positions of influence. They're certainly not politicians. But in the course of their ordinary lives, they choose to work towards the good of others rather than the destruction of others. They choose life, and they do so at great risk to their own lives. Pharaoh eventually summons the midwives. "Why have you allowed the boys to live?" he asks. They respond cleverly. The Hebrew women are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. Their retort silences the king. Unfortunately, it doesn't end his evil intentions. It simply turns them into public policy. As the Hebrews continue to multiply, Pharaoh commands all his people, "Every boy that is born to the Hebrews you shall throw into the Nile." Pharaoh's policy is no longer designed to keep the Israelites' population in control, but to eliminate it altogether. Every male child now comes into the world with a death sentence on his head. This is the world that Moses is born into. So for the first 3 months of his life, Moses' mother does the only thing she can to protect her son. She hides him. When Moses becomes too big to hide any longer, she uses Pharaoh's chosen means of destruction, the Nile River, in order to save her baby. For both she and the Hebrew midwives, resistance means disobeying unjust laws in order to obey God and care for those who are most vulnerable. In a surprising twist in the story, it's the Pharaoh's own daughter who rescues Moses. She comes down to the river, sees the baby, hears its cry, takes pity, draws him out of the water, and provides for his daily needs. Her actions mirror how God rescues first Israel, but then all people. Pharaoh's daughter's actions also serve as a call to us. As followers of Jesus, we too are called to respond to injustice and bring life to those around us. As Pharaoh's daughter demonstrates, responding to injustice starts with seeing. As much as we may want to at times, we can't turn a blind eye to what's happening around us. Instead, we have to see injustice. Seeing injustice starts with acknowledging how our own systems favor some but not others. how our privilege makes us culpable in systemic oppression. It extends to wrestling with whether we are the oppressed or the oppressors. It involves understanding that oppression dehumanizes everyone, those who are oppressed as well as those who oppress. It demands we name things for what they are, that we call out racism, white supremacy, genocide, and other atrocities wherever and whenever they exist. Responding to injustice also means getting close enough to the oppressed to hear their cries, whether that's by watching the news, reading books written by people of color, or having first-hand conversations with those who are different than us. We need to find ways to genuinely learn the stories of the oppressed. Hearing the stories of the oppressed results in compassion. It's no accident that Pharaoh's daughter feels pity for the Hebrew baby only after she sees it and hears its cries. At that point, she's close enough to feel the baby's pain, and that pain compels her to act. So it is with us. When we see and hear the stories of the oppressed, our compassion grows. Genuine compassion produces action. For the Pharaoh's daughter, this means providing for Moses' daily needs long term, first by paying his own mother to nurse him, and then by raising him in the palace. That's the thing about justice. True commitment to justice requires long-term faithfulness. While injustice sometimes demands immediate solutions, food for the hungry, shelter for the homeless, and peace for those in war-torn places, most injustice also requires long-term work. Unjust policies cannot be overturned overnight. Neither can systems that have been used to oppress people for centuries. Instead, justice work requires long-term commitment, and often with it, advocacy. That's what our fifth and final heroine, Moses' sister, models for us in today's Exodus story. After observing Pharaoh's daughter with the baby, Moses' sister eventually steps forward and asks, "Shall I go and get you a Hebrew woman to nurse the child for you?" She advocates for the needs of her brother and ensures that his biological mother will have a hand in raising him. In the same way, those of us with privilege are called to advocate for those with none, to use our voice to speak for those who are voiceless, and to raise up leaders and share our platform with those whose position or skin color gives them none. 2 weeks ago, I, like many of you, watched in horror as white supremacists descended on Charlottesville, spewing hatred, creating divisiveness, and inciting violence. Amidst images of clubs and swastikas, the picture that gave me hope that day came from the counter-protest. In it, pastors of all races stand arm in arm, quietly resisting, standing up to violence, knowing that doing so might cost them their lives. Here in today's story, we see another chain of people, of women, some Hebrew and some not, standing arm in arm, fighting injustice and silencing evil. These women fight injustice while going about their normal work and raising their children. They fight injustice by advocating for others, seeing and hearing the oppressed, and allowing themselves to be moved by their stories enough to make long-term commitments to justice. I wish I could say that this story is one from our history books, but unfortunately it's one that plays out all too often today. So, when injustice surrounds us, may we have the courage to live out our allegiance to Jesus, who is the Messiah, by standing with the poor and the oppressed, the very people he stood with. May we link arms with these women of Exodus and join in creatively resisting destructive forces by breathing new life into our congregation, community, and world. And may we join with people of all races to dismantle systemic oppression and instead work to bring God's kingdom here to earth. Amen.